Let us pray. Gracious God, as we turn to your word for us, may the Spirit of God rest upon us. Help us to be steadfast in our hearing, in our speaking, in our believing, and in our living. Amen. Today's scripture is from Luke 12, verses 13 to 21. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Friend, who set me to be a judge or arbitrator over you?" And he said to them, "Take care, be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." Then he told them a parable. The land of a rich man produced abundantly. And he thought to himself, "What should I do? For I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, 'Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you. And the things you have prepared, whose will they be?' So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich toward God." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Once again, we find Jesus on the road to Jerusalem, and he is running into a trap. This time it is not the religious and strict adherents, the Pharisees, nor is it an agent of the house of Herod fishing for a treason charge, nor is it a scribe or a lawyer looking to catch Jesus breaking the law of Moses. Today we got someone trying to pull Jesus into a family dispute. We have someone from the crowd yelling, "Tell my brother to share or to divide the inheritance." Now, a modern response would be someone trained in family systems theory would point out that this is classic triangulation. What you should do is talk directly to your brother, maybe work it out with them, and if not, maybe just work on yourself for a while. But Jesus did not kind of live in a time of therapy speak or group counseling. Instead, he kind of solves the question by teaching and giving us a parable. This is not a parable of the prodigal son or his brother. That is a few chapters later in the Gospel of Luke. Rather, he tells this parable where money is front and center. And if you guessed it, we are going to be stewardship adjacent today. It's not even November, so you're welcome for something out of season. But one of the reasons we talk about inheritance, wealth, money is because it has been part of our lives for over 2,000 years. In fact, it is often one of our constant worries in life. By the way, it is just under a month before tax day. You can thank me for that a little bit later. But every few generations, though, we also have kind of this influence of society. We try to kind of put on or imprint our modern views or maybe some more business savvy onto Jesus. You know, we can look at Jesus, and sometimes in the past, like in the 1920s, we said, well, he took a startup, he grew it into the biggest worldwide corporation. Back in the 20s, that was kind of the deal when everybody was going great for kind of that corporate culture, when kind of the Monopolies had been broken down, and corporatism was a big thing to do. In the 2020s, you may have heard kind of a Bitcoin bro, and he may have perceived Jesus as getting on the ground floor and how apostolic succession is basically blockchain. Maybe you haven't been roped into one of these conversations at Thanksgiving. There always seems to be one person in the family that is kind of on that Bitcoin train and wants everybody else to hop on. But sometimes this text is called the rich fool, which at first doesn't make much sense. You know, many of us kind of know that old saying, fools and their money are soon parted. And, you know, kind of the interesting thing about this is the guy gets parted rather than the money in this case. And it might be kind of somebody who studied the original language called this guy kind of the rich fool. Because in this scenario, if you look at it, this guy has a one-time bumper of crop. Kind of the language says this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Think of just having a great year of having peaches in Palisade or pears up in Paonia, Colorado. And then this guy decides that he's going to tear down his shed and build grain silos. Also kind of embedded in this story is someone who is not well-versed in agriculture. The Gospel of Luke tends to be a little bit more on the urban side. But everybody knows you don't build grain silos when you have a bumper crop of apples. So in some ways, this guy is kind of a little bit off. This text, like most parables, turns what we think is good and comes at us in a different way. Now, a farmer, a businessman, when they anticipate more inventory, they do go out and build. That is something that is sensible to do. We also might kind of hear some echoes of that old story about the grasshopper and the ant. You know, Aesop's fable. You know, we may have grown up kind of with Walt Disney kind of doing shows about it. There may have been a kind of a story about VeggieTales or some of these other cartoon stories, but Aesop's fables of the grasshopper and the ant have been around hundreds of years before Jesus was born, and most people in the Greek-speaking world knew it. And if we don't, we can be reminded that it's a story about a grasshopper who jumps and dances all summer, and meanwhile, the ant was working dawn to dusk and stored up all the food for the season. And when the winter comes, because some years winter does come, the grasshopper starves and is at the point of death, and he begs the ant for food, and the ant retorts, well, why doesn't the grasshopper just go and dance his way through winter like he did summer? Now, Jesus kind of takes this common children's story, he kind of exposes also maybe what could be the other side of the ant, of somebody who has prepared and done likewise. You know, if we were to look at this parable, we would see the landowner is kind of the ant. He is stored up. He has done what you are supposed to do. Which also maybe one of the reasons we don't like this story is because we get awkward around money and spirituality. Studying this week, I came across a commentary by David Lose, and he talks about how we have kind of this problem with faith and money. He points out that rarely do we do mission work in places that are wealthy or wealthier than our own neighborhoods. And I will kind of add that there was kind of a thing in social media, like right when it was first coming out, there was kind of this trope, especially this time of year, you would always have kind of the sorority girl or the fraternity boys going on kind of the spring break mission trip. You know, those who didn't want to go and party, they would do some mission. And it'd be interesting because you would see kind of picture of them, and sometimes some of the schools were able to go to foreign missions, and so you would kind of see the skinny third world kid, usually with kind of the caption underneath, "It changed my life." And these were always noticeable because this post was always kind of a few before the March Madness victory dances. You know, you got to see how much it changed their life when they were going out and partying after March Madness. Or maybe it's just because when I was in school, Maryland finally won the Final Four, but that could just be me. But 20 years ago, I did go on a mission trip with my seminary. We went to Ghana, West Africa, and one of the fun things about this is we visited kind of our seminary partner. We also visited two different churches, the Presbyterian Church in Ghana and the Evangelical Presbyterian Church in Ghana. And what was fun about this is we actually kind of stayed either on the seminary grounds or we stayed in the homes of different people. And it was interesting because we were there 20 years ago, and we kind of had a moment where kind of all of us seminary students were kind of holding our smiles a little bit. And it was kind of the time where kind of some of the professors and a few of the local Ghanaian seminarians were saying, we're thinking about sending missionaries over to Europe. Their churches are not growing there like they are here, which was kind of natural because the church has kind of expanded greatly in West Africa and the whole continent of Africa at large. It is kind of one of those things that they were seeing that the church was not growing in Europe and they needed to send missionaries there. And that was kind of just one of the few cultural disconnects we had. I remember some of our seminarians, they would kind of be dealing with the program that David Lose kind of shared with them. It was my friend Elise and Kate. And they ended up staying in the house of one of kind of the Ghanaian elite. This was the home of a wealthy businessman who had turned kind of a government official. He was basically kind of the head of the Ghanaian FBI. And these two girls were kind of sheepish about how this visit was with their with the host family. And so when we all kind of joined back in group, they asked us what we did in our host families as well. And I mentioned that me and my buddy Brandon, who we had both lived in Maryland, we got to see the tomb of the American philosopher and historian W.B. Du Bois. And we went on to pastoral visits with kind of the youth pastor, and we ended up going into kind of one of the shanty towns. And one of the reasons we went into kind of that environment is Brandon, who is African American and from Baltimore, wanted to see kind of one of the slave castles or one of the areas where they had traded slaves. And to get there, we had to kind of drive through town, and we ended up kind of the stoplight right next to kind of the prison teeming, and it was an open-air prison teeming with prisoners. And it was kind of one of those experiences where we had seen kind of how the other half of Ghana lived, and we were so drained that we just had to tell the Dutch girls that we had totally set up a date with at the Irish bar, because it turns out the Ghanaians do like St. Patrick's Day as well, that we could not kind of go and hang out with them. And the girls were kind of stunned and kind of surprised at us, and they said, well, we were given several dresses worth hundreds of dollars, and they told that they were kind of dealing with this. It's like we knew these dresses that they just gave to us were, the equivalent of months of wages for the average housemaid that was in that house. That they shared how they had eaten fancy food provided by a private chef, how they pretty much had to stay inside the entire time between the guard dogs and the armed agents because, the guy who owned the house was kind of a fancy government official. And so they pretty much spent all their time kind of in this gated community in Ghana. Later, I found out that these two had to kind of sit down and kind of hash things out. They had to kind of process what was going on. It turns out, when they thought they were going to Ghana, they thought they were going to go to kind of the third world. They were going to kind of experience something different. And here they were in an area that was much wealthier than the place that they actually had grown up. They were daughters of pastors and car mechanics in Appalachia, and they were in for some culture shock. And it was interesting because they were sharing with us and said, it's like both our experiences were very rich. It's just our zip code was a little bit more wealthier than everybody else's. When we go back to this parable, it makes us wonder, what do we do with the abundance that God gives us? In this parable, we kind of get this answer is probably not the best thing to hoard it. And let's be honest, though, that wealth can bring some material comfort. Perhaps some of us thought about buying air conditioning in the last few days, because if it's this hot in March, what is it going to be this summer? And there are some things where kind of wealth can cushion the blows of everyday life. Once we have our basic needs met, we can also feel this sense of worthiness, feel this sense of security. We sometimes believe that we have all these good things. We are special because we have them. But we also know, especially in this parable, that can change overnight. And that is the tragedy of this rich fool. It never crosses his mind that life could change. He gets a one-time windfall, and the rest is going to be sunshine and lollipops for him. In this case, we also notice that the crops, the barns, and the mentality that we can eat, drink, and be merry can come crashing down in a second. All that he had came as a gift of God, and that can be taken away just as quick. Wealth and money in this case are not evil, but rather it is a distraction to the reality of life. It also becomes a problem when we are not generous with God or our neighbor. In fact, the implication of Jesus telling this story, he leaves us that this landowner could have made better decisions. He doesn't go out and name it, but during that time, if you got a lot of money, you didn't have to create a big vault like Scrooge McDuck or put your culinary name on a culinary school if you particularly like to eat, drink, and be merry. But he could have focused on God or those in his community. Rather, he seemed to focus on the future rather than helping those he could here and now. The landowner may have thanked God in that time by making an offering in the temple. He may have supported education of the next generation in a synagogue school. Instead of tearing down sheds and building barns, he could have provided for the hungry out of that bumper harvest. By the way, as I mentioned earlier, manna's shelves are a little bit low, so we might want to think about if we are having our own bumper harvest this year to donate a little. But later in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus tells another parable, and he tells parables of the lost. We have a lost sheep, a lost coin, and a lost son. And when they discover that which has been lost, whether it is the sheep, the coin, or the son, Jesus tells a story where they celebrate to God and their neighbors by throwing a party. And the sad thing about this parable, in contrast, is this landowner does not celebrate with God or his neighbors. He is completely self-absorbed. He does not see a future where life will be different, where he may be doing poorly. He just kind of takes what he gets and keeps it for himself. But this season, as we look at a future that is less certain, with all kind of the chaos we see in society, we might want to ask ourselves, where do we want to celebrate with God? Do we want to donate our time and talent? Where can we help our neighbor? Where can we honor God in our own lives? And we also need to think about what is happening next. Not so much as storing up, but being prepared for the next thing that God is doing. We can ask ourselves how we can be rich with God in that case. It may not be our money, but we might need to offer hospitality, offer thanksgiving, especially as we are looking to welcoming a pastor hopefully soon. Do we need to store up some of our energy to be more welcoming, to show the gifts that God has given us in Durango, and share in the ways that we can work together? In this text of the landowner, we see that life can change in an instant, that what we think is solid and secure can go away. But we also can see that we can be generous, that we can honor God. And the here and now, we can also show what God has given